Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into a real-life story that's got some pretty dark twists and turns.
Oh yeah, this one's a doozy.
You know, we talk about these crazy historical events all the time, but this one really hit me hard, I gotta say.
Yeah, this one's really something.
I mean, you remember that show Squid Games, right?
Oh, for sure. That whole social commentary thing, the competition, the high stakes, it was wild.
It was, and it got me thinking, how much of that kind of darkness actually exists in the real world?
It's a good question. And actually, there are some pretty disturbing parallels to be found if you know where to look.
Exactly. So get this. Today, we're diving into a scandal in South Korea known as Brothers Home.
Ooh, okay, I've had whispers about this.
Yeah, it's not exactly common knowledge, but it's a story that needs to be told. I mean, the things that happen there, just wow.
All right, I'm ready. Lay it on me.
Okay, so picture this. South Korea in the 1980s, they're gearing up to host the 1988 Olympics, right?
All right, they're on the world stage, big time.
Exactly. So there's this huge push to present this image of a modern, successful nation.
I can imagine. The pressure must have been intense to make a good impression.
Oh, absolutely. They wanted to show off their progress, their stability, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, that makes sense. But where does Brothers Home fit into all of this?
Well, that's where things get dark. See, part of this whole modernization campaign involved, cleaning up the streets of Seoul.
Cleaning up? What do you mean by that?
They were targeting anyone they deemed a vagrant.
Vagrant, so like homeless people.
That was part of it, yeah. But they took this really broad, really messed up definition of vagrant.
Oh, so it wasn't just people living on the streets.
Nope. We're talking sleeping in train stations, drinking in public, even just looking disheveled. Basically, anyone who didn't fit this, picture-perfect image of a citizen was at risk.
Wow, so basically they were criminalizing poverty and nonconformity.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. Police officers were actually getting bonuses for rounding up these so-called vagrants.
Hold on, bonuses? Seriously?
Yeah, talk about a messed up incentive system.
It's like they were actively encouraging the targeting of vulnerable people.
You got it. And that brings us to Brothers Home. This was a massive compound, over 60 concrete buildings surrounded by barbed wire fences. They were holding over 3,500 people there.
3,500? That's huge.
Yeah.
What exactly was this place? Some kind of prison?
Officially, it was called a social welfare facility, but the reality was far, far more sinister. People were taken there against their will, often based on, the flimsiest of pretexts.
Oh, God. Okay, so this is starting to sound a lot like that whole Squid Games vibe.
Yeah, the similarities are chilling. Inside Brothers Home, they stripped these people of their names, gave them numbers, forced them into identical uniforms. It was a total dehumanization process.
It's giving me chills just thinking about it.
Yeah.
So what happened to these people once they were inside? Did they, actually have games, in the show?
I mean, not in the literal sense of, playing for money or freedom.
But there were games.
Yeah, but these were about control, punishment, just inflicting unimaginable suffering.
This is where it gets really heavy, huh?
It does. And I know it's tough to hear, but I think it's important to understand the extent of what happened there. Can you give us some examples of these games?
Okay. One that really stands out is called the Han River Bridge. They would force 50 people into a human centipede formation, literally crawling on their hands and knees, tied together.
Oh my God. I'm getting nauseous just thinking about it.
And if anyone fell, severe punishment. You can imagine the fear, the pain, the utter helplessness of being trapped in that position.
This is horrific.
And that's just one example. They had all sorts of these twisted games. Hiroshima, Cup Roll, each one more brutal than the last. Some involved hanging people upside down, rolling them up in blankets and kicking them, forcing them to fight each other.
You talked about the psychological impact earlier. What were the long-term effects of these games on the people trapped there?
Living under constant threat of violence, never knowing when the next punishment would come. That kind of terror does something to you. It breaks you down, strips away your sense of self. It takes your hope.
And what about the physical effects?
Oh, the scars are real. Many survivors have talked about the lasting physical pain, the injuries that never fully healed. It's a constant reminder of the horrors they endured.
It's heartbreaking to think about what they went through, but the games, those were just one part of the horror, right?
That's right. Because at night, at Brothers Home, a different kind of terror took over.
What do you mean?
There are accounts of widespread sexual abuse,
Men
and women. It was rampant.
God, it's hard to even fathom that this could happen in a place that was supposed to be helping people.
One survivor, Han, actually wrote a book about his experiences at Brothers Home.
Oh, wow.
His account is just gut-wrenching. In his book, he describes actually witnessing a young boy being beaten to death.
Beaten to death.
Yeah. The boy was having a seizure, and they beat him to death for it.
It's just evil. Pure evil.
This wasn't a place of care. It was a place of cruelty. It was all about control. The power dynamics were so skewed that abuse was basically inevitable, and they even had this makeshift psych ward.
A psych ward.
Yes, where they sent anyone who couldn't be broken by the games. They would just drug them and subject them to even more horrific treatment.
It's like they were trying to erase their humanity completely.
You know, there's this one story that really illustrates just how twisted this whole place was. There was a young boy. His name was Goom. He'd been taken to Brothers Home, spent his days dreaming of escape, imagining this portal that would lead him back to his family. And one day, he spots his father. Inside the compound, he thinks they'll be reunited. But it turns out, his father had also been taken there.
Oh, that's just awful. A place meant to help people, tearing families apart instead.
Yeah, and here's the thing about the motive behind Brothers Home. It wasn't about, like, entertainment for the wealthy, like in Squid Games. When they raided the compound, they found a vault with $8 million in it, in today's money.
Wait, $8 million? What?
Yeah, something much darker than just forced labor and so-called rehabilitation was happening at Brothers Home.
So we've got these brutal games, horrific abuse, and now millions of dollars stashed away. It's starting to sound like a conspiracy thriller.
It really does, doesn't it?
What in the world was going on at Brothers Home?
Well, that's a story for part 2.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat now.
So that money, those millions we talked about, that leads us down a really dark path.
Okay, darker than what we've already covered. That's hard to imagine.
It is, yeah. See, that money points to something truly horrific. International adoption scams.
Adoption scams. So they were making money off these people in more than one way.
I know, it just gets worse and worse. And it's especially awful when you think about it. Many of the people held at Brothers Home, they were kids.
Oh, man. I was afraid you were going to say that.
Some of them were as young as 4 years old.
It's one thing to exploit adults, but to prey on innocent children, it's just, I don't even have words.
It's a whole other level of depravity. And those kids, they were incredibly vulnerable. They were torn from their families, often on false pretenses, desperately wanted love and stability.
So they were easy targets, basically. And the people running Brothers Home, they saw that, I guess?
Sadly, yeah. They realized they could make a lot of money. Huge demand for international adoptions, especially from Western countries like the United States.
Makes sense, I guess.
But these adoptions, you know, they weren't exactly ethical.
I had a feeling. What did they do?
They completely fabricated stories about the children's backgrounds, said they were orphans, that their families had abandoned them.
Oh, gosh.
Just totally erased these kids' identities to make them more appealing to adoptive parents.
That's so messed up.
It is. And they charged huge fees for these adoptions.
No, I bet they did.
They were making a fortune exploiting these kids and lining their pockets. Just a vicious cycle of exploitation.
It's heartbreaking to think about those children who had already endured so much, then ripped away from their culture, their heritage, all for profit.
And the lasting impact. It's devastating.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
A lot of these adoptees struggle with feelings of abandonment, identity confusion. They feel disconnected from their roots. It's like they've been robbed of their history, their language, their sense of belonging.
That's a deep wound.
It is. And then there's another layer to all of this, to this whole horrific story. Those who didn't survive Brothers Home.
Oh, man. That's the part that always stays with me in these kinds of stories. What happened to them?
Officially, the death toll at Brothers Home was almost 600. But many believe the actual number is much higher.
Why the discrepancy? You think they were hiding something?
This was a place where people were intentionally dehumanized. Their record keeping was awful. And they definitely had a reason to cover up the truth, you know, about the extent of what was happening there.
So people could just disappear?
Pretty much, yeah. And the way they disposed of the bodies, that's just as awful as the abuse itself.
What do you mean? How did they...
Survivors have said they saw bodies dumped in mass graves. Others, they were cremated in these makeshift ovens, ashes just scattered. No ceremony or anything.
It's like they were trying to wipe out every trace of them.
Yeah, like they never even existed. Just a chilling reminder of the total disregard for human life at Brothers Home. But even with all this darkness, there is a little bit of hope. Some of the survivors, like Han, they've dedicated their lives to exposing the truth, to getting justice.
That's amazing. What's it been like for them? I can't imagine it's been easy.
Oh, it's been a long, hard road. They've faced skepticism, roadblocks in the government, even threats.
Wow, really? Threats?
Yeah, there are people who want to keep this whole thing buried. But these survivors, they've persisted.
It's inspiring, honestly. What finally brought Brothers home to light? Was there a specific event that kind of broke the story open?
It was a few things, really. Some journalists wouldn't let it go, kept digging, and then a few really brave individuals who had seen everything firsthand, they finally spoke out.
Those whistleblowers, they're the real heroes, risking their own safety to expose the truth.
Oh, for sure. They were taking a huge risk,
Ah.
but they were vital in breaking the silence.
So, was there a key moment, a turning point?
There was this former guard at Brothers' home. He finally came forward, told his story. He had seen how they treated the people there, and he just couldn't keep quiet anymore.
I bet that testimony was powerful.
It was. Completely blew apart that whole image they had built of Brothers' home as this benevolent institution.
And that's when things really started to change.
Yeah, it got national attention, international attention, and the government, they finally had to do something.
Did they? I mean, was there any real justice?
It wasn't immediate, no.
Of course not.
Some of the people responsible for Brothers' home, yeah, they faced charges. Some were convicted, but many, many others get away with it.
It's always the same, isn't it? The powerful get away with it.
It's frustrating. And even for those who are held accountable, it doesn't erase the pain of what happened.
No, it doesn't. What about the survivors? How are they doing now?
Well, they're still dealing with the trauma, both physical and emotional. Those scars, they might never fully heal.
That's heavy stuff.
But there's another aspect to this whole story, something that often gets overlooked.
Okay, what's that?
They used food and salt as tools of torture.
Wait, what? You mentioned saltwater torture before, but what do you mean about food?
Well, the lack of food, really. Starvation was a big part of how they controlled the inmates at Brothers' home. The rations were tiny, barely enough to keep them alive.
So hunger was another form of punishment.
Exactly. It weakened them, physically and mentally. Made them easier to control.
That's so messed up. But the salt.
They used it in a few different ways to inflict pain. We already talked about forcing them to drink salt water, which is just agonizing.
I can only imagine.
But they also would rub salt into open wounds.
Oh, God, no. That sounds excruciating. Why would they do that?
I know, it's awful. Salt, it's easily available, cheap, and man, it hurts. Just a really disturbing example of how they use simple things to torture people.
It's not true.
And yet it really gets to the heart of what torture is. Taking something as basic as food or salt and using it to hurt and control people.
It's disturbing, to say the least.
It is. And it brings us to a really important question. How did this kind of abuse go on for so long? Right under everyone's noses. How did nobody notice?
That's what I've been wondering this whole time.
It's wild, right? Like, how could something like this stay hidden for so long? Especially with the whole world watching South Korea get ready for the Olympics.
I know, it's crazy. Like, you'd think someone would have noticed, right?
Well, there were a few things that kind of allowed it to happen. For one, South Korea was going through some big changes back then. Rapid growth, social transformation, the whole deal. And the government, they were super focused on looking good on the world stage.
Yeah, they wanted to project an image of success, right?
Exactly. And they were willing to do whatever it took to achieve that, even if it meant ignoring, well, ignoring things like Brothers' home.
So it was kind of like national pride came before basic human decency.
It's harsh, but yeah, that's kind of what it boils down to. The Olympics were their big moment, and they weren't going to let anything like Brothers' home ruin that.
So the people who were considered undesirable, they were just collateral damage.
Sadly, yeah. The authorities looked the other way because, well, it was convenient for them. It served their agenda.
And I imagine the general atmosphere in South Korea back then played a role, too. It was a different time, right?
Oh, for sure. South Korea was just coming out of decades of authoritarian rule, so there was still a culture of silence. People were afraid to speak up against those in power, even if they suspected something was wrong.
So basically, government pressure, societal fear, and just plain old conformity all contributed to this whole mess, allowed it to continue unchecked.
Yeah, it was the perfect recipe for exploitation and abuse. But, even in those kinds of situations, the truth has a way of coming out eventually.
It does. So what happened? What finally exposed Brothers' home?
It wasn't just one thing. There were some really tenacious journalists who refused to give up on the story. And then there were the whistleblowers. Those brave individuals who had witnessed the horrors firsthand and finally decided to speak up.
Those whistleblowers are amazing. I mean, they put themselves at risk coming forward like that. They're the real heroes, I think.
Absolutely.
Mm.
They risked everything to expose the truth, and without them, who knows how long this would have gone on. They were so important in finally breaking the silence.
Was there like a specific incident that kind of blew the lid off the whole thing?
Yeah, there was. It was a former guard from Brothers Home. He finally decided to tell his story. He had seen it all, the abuse, the torture, everything. And I guess he just couldn't live with it anymore.
I can only imagine how powerful that testimony must have been.
Oh, it was huge. It completely destroyed that whole carefully crafted image of Brothers Home as this caring place.
And that's when public pressure became too much to ignore.
Yep. The story went national, then international. Suddenly, everyone was talking about Brothers Home. The government couldn't sweep it under the rug anymore.
So, was there any real justice? I mean, did the people behind all this face any consequences?
Well, it's complicated. Some of the key players were charged and some were convicted, but a lot of them got away with it.
Figures. It's always the same story, isn't it? The people in power get away with their crimes. It's frustrating.
It is. And, even for those who were held accountable, it doesn't erase the suffering of the victims, all those people who were tortured, abused, and killed. It's a tragedy that can't be undone.
And for the survivors, well, their trauma, it continues. Like you said before, those scars might never fully heal.
It's a long, hard road to recovery. But it is possible. Many survivors have shown incredible strength and resilience. They've found ways to rebuild their lives, find meaning and purpose. It's truly inspiring.
It really is. It just goes to show you the human spirit can endure so much. So this deep dive, it started with a fictional show like Squid Games, but it ended up taking us down a pretty dark path. We uncovered a real-life horror story.
It does make you think, huh? About the lines between fiction and reality.
Yeah, it does. And, thinking about all that money they found, the whole system of exploitation, it makes you wonder, are there other places like Brothers Home out there?
It's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
How many other places are operating under the radar, hiding in plain sight? It's a chilling thought.
It is. And it's a reminder that we can't just take things at face value, right? We got to stay informed, ask questions, and hold people accountable, especially those in power.
Absolutely. And, the biggest takeaway from all of this, we have to listen to the survivors. Their stories, they shine a light on the dark corners of our world, the places we'd rather not see. But we need to see them. We need to learn from them.
If we want to create a better world, a more just and humane world, we have to confront these uncomfortable truths.
Exactly. We all have a role to play in that.
So to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It was a heavy one, but it's a story that needs to be told. And remember, the fight for justice never ends. Stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged. The world needs your voice.